What is up, guys? If it wasn't raining every day, I'd be back at a beach like we did for the last video. But it's raining, so I'm home. In my home studio or my room. Anyway, today we're not talking about latitude and longitude. We're talking about the codfish described in the book called Cod. So you might be wondering, why is one simple fish so important in the foundation of our entire country? Well, there's actually a pretty simple answer to it. When Europeans came to the Americas to settle, it wasn't just for religious freedom. That was something they came here for, but they also came here to fish, because through the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, cod was one of the most traded items in the world market. One reason cod was so traded was before we overfished it, it was really a common fish and it wasn't that hard to catch. Also, cod laid millions of eggs, although really only 2 or 3 survived towards adulthood. The fact that they laid a lot of eggs made it so that repopulating wasn't super hard, until, of course, we fished more than they could reproduce. And in the Middle Ages, cod was something that could actually last long by salting. It wasn't something that would spoil immediately, which in the Middle Ages, of course, before refrigeration and modern freezing, it was great to have something that could last and not spoil immediately. In addition, as a quick fact, cod also tasted better than other salted fish, which of course added to its value. And basically when fishermen caught it, they had to cut it open and salt it. Now, if they cut it wrong, the fish actually wasn't wasted. A trade market developed when slaves would eat the not as high quality fish, as in it was a bad cut. They could still salt it, and they could still trade it for a profit because that would be fed to the slaves. As I mentioned before, the slave trade actually had a huge impact on the profit of cod. Bad cuts, which could be made by one simple mistake, could still be sold and could still be profited off of by selling them to slave owners. And because the cod was of lesser quality, it would be fed to slaves. So when slavery was abolished, that led to the decrease in cod sales of bad quality cod, because most countries don't want to buy cod of bad quality. They only want the best quality with the best cut and split. So the whole market for bad quality cod is pretty much destroyed when slavery was abolished. Despite the fact that you might not have learned about cod in grade school, it's really been a huge part of American history. In fact, the treaty that ended the war in 1812 and the Convention of 1818 actually granted fishing rights and divided them between America and England. So despite the fact that maybe you didn't learn about it, it was actually mentioned in so many different meetings and conventions and treaties that you've learned about before. As I mentioned earlier, there were limits and there were a lot of arguing for fishing territories that you might not have heard of before. One of the more recent ones, it started with the 30-mile limit, which pretty much entitled a country to 30 miles off their shore. That would be their fishing area, and they were in control. That eventually extended to 200 miles, which left landlocked countries essentially cut out of the picture in the cod market, and countries like Spain that didn't have an extensive coastline would also be partially excluded from the trade. Also, around the time of the 30-mile to 200-mile limit, more so around the 200-mile limit, the world began to realize that fish were not an infinite but a finite resource. It was previously believed by people like Huxley that fish were just infinite and they were forever spawning. But because of hundreds of years of overfishing, that caught up to us, and as a world, we realized that fish were not infinite, and in fact they were finite, which actually led to the Cod Wars. The Cod Wars essentially link up with the 200-mile limit, where famously British fishermen would go into Icelandic waters and try to fish for cod. So interestingly enough, Icelandic schooners would go in and they would do something to sabotage the British boats, like cut the lines so they lose their net, or other things like that. There were actually no casualties, despite the fact that bullets were fired in the Cod Wars. No one died. However, you can't count the millions of dollars that were probably lost on the British side when things like their nets were being cut, which pretty much ruined their entire trip. Obviously, we know of wars for oil. There have been many in recent times because oil, like cod, is a finite resource, but it was never really talked about, at least in classes that I personally have taken, that cod, there were wars for cod before there were things like wars for oil. We discovered that cod was this finite resource. However, to this day, we still overfish. So the Cod Wars are pretty much a huge reminder of the fact that overfishing is real, and it's very easy to kill off a population of fish. And with the advancement of technology on steamboats, when we go from schooners and dories to steamboats, it's much easier to catch huge amounts of fish in one go. So that just exasperates the problem of overfishing. I think the next big idea, we've already discussed it, but the last line of the book is, "It is harder to kill off fish than mammals, but after 1,000 years of hunting the Atlantic cod, we know it can be done." And I think that's a great phrase and a great idea to end on, because we always talk about endangered land mammals and species on land, but we don't really discuss the problems that happen in our oceans, which cover the earth so much more than the land and can have such huge impacts on the economy. Cod was one of the most traded things throughout human history. So once the 200-mile zone was put into effect, according to the book on page 171, some 90% of the world's known fishing grounds fell within 200 miles of the coast of at least one nation. So with the 200-mile zone in effect, that leaves only 10% of the world's oceans to be open fishing grounds. The other 90% under the 200-mile Act were owned by some country. So when you put that into perspective, only 10% of the oceans can actually be freely fished in. And this all happened in 1976, and at that point, cod had already been overfished. When you think about it, cod has been being fished since the Middle Ages, which were really ending in the 1500s. That's when this all really started, at least being documented. But it took until 1902 for the first government, being the British government, to admit overfishing could be a problem. So that's 400 years of overfishing with technological advancements to increase overfishing before somebody admitted that, in fact, it is possible to overfish. Along with the last sentence of the book, another sentence that I think really puts overfishing into perspective can be found on page 185, and the quote is from Ralph Mayo. He's a marine biologist for the U.S. National Marine Fisheries Service, and he calls this problem the perception problem. And he says, quote, "You see some cod and assume it's the tip of the iceberg, but it could be the whole iceberg." And I think that quote is a fantastic way of describing this problem of overfishing, where fishermen would see some cod and go, "Great, here's some fish. There must be so many more." But the problem is, because of overfishing, that's not like the tip of the iceberg, and that's not just the start of the fish, that's all the fish. And that's a great way, in my opinion, of describing the problem, and really a good way of putting it into better words. Really, to wrap it up, it's hard to put into words how important cod was in the start of the Americas, because everyone thinks people came here for religious freedom, and that is a reason, but really something we were never taught was that they came here to fish and to make profit on their own by fishing cod. Obviously, Cape Cod is really the only thing we really know about cod, is that Cape Cod is a place in New England. But it's really hard to just describe how important this one fish was to developing one of the biggest, most successful countries in history. But like everything, we've overfished it, and we've depleted our resource of cod to the point where if we keep going the way we're going, the fish could become extinct or impossible to make any profit off of. Just because something doesn't go extinct doesn't mean we've hunted it to the point of extinction and we can't make any money off it anymore. Sadly, that's probably the way we would go. I hope that we don't. But like the lobster and the horseshoe crab, which my grandparents told me stories, and my grandparents are only less than 60 years older than me, so even recently, horseshoe crabs and lobsters would be walking on the beach. I've never seen a horseshoe crab or a lobster on the beach. And you can tell by the price of lobster at restaurants, it's expensive because it's rare now. So we've hunted so many marine species really to the point of endangerment and even extinction, but cod is the most prevalent and the most important. And I think this book does a fantastic job of explaining the problem and really giving an amazing history of how one fish changed the world. And personally, it opened my eyes to how bad overfishing is and really what would happen if we do kill off this fish. But I think it's really important. I think anyone that lives in America should read this, just because of its history and its importance of something that I personally never knew. So, in total, really this book, the first 170 pages are really the history of cod, which is great. But if you're going to take anything out of this book, take away the last 50 pages. Look at the Cod Wars and the lengths people went to protect their own water. No one owns the ocean, but people tried to own the ocean because of cod. But at the end of the day, we still overfished it, and we don't know if there's a point that we can return. We could be at the point of no return now, to where this fish that really ruled the global economy, we might not even be able to make immense profits off it anymore, which is truly a shame that we've done this to ourselves.